Good morning, happy Wednesday. So we are moving on to our next little section just to give you guys a little idea of what we have left and where we're going with this. Today we're going to look at something called classification and taxonomy. So that will kind of be the rest of this week. Wednesday, Thursday, you guys will kind of use that flex day to finish everything up. Monday is Memorial Day, so we'll be off. Tuesday, and starting on Tuesday and going into next week and the following week, we'll be working on some stuff with evolution. So we'll talk about Darwin and, how evolution, the idea of evolution and how organisms evolve and how things change. We'll look at it from a biological point of view or scientific point of view. From there, we'll kind of go into evolution of animals and we'll talk about how animals have kind of changed. In order to get that, we have to look at this classification system. And we'll look at kingdoms and phylums and classes and orders and families and genus and species, which we did a little bit of that when we did our Pine Barrens food web. If you remember way back early in the year, and we talked about some of this information already. So we're going to start off with what is known as taxonomy. Taxonomy, anything onomy, we're looking at the science of identifying organisms or ways to classify them. So you guys kind of do classification all the time, hopefully. You organize yourself, you organize your binder so you know what subject is in each binder. You organize your room so you know where each piece of clothing that you may need is located. So if you're looking for a pair of socks, you're not digging through each and every drawer looking for that pair of socks, I hope at least. You go into the supermarket. Things are classified, things are organized. All your produce is in one aisle. And within that produce, all your apples are together in one area. So you don't have to kind of go and try to figure out where everything is. Cereals are all in one aisle, meats are all in one area, vegetables are all in one area, and so on. So this classification system is used to organize things. So we group organisms by their characteristics. Same thing as what we would do within your room with clothing. Same thing we would do in a supermarket with food. So you guys classify things each and every day of your life, whether you think about it or not. But when scientists do it in order to classify organisms, they're going to group the organisms by their characteristics as well as evolutionary relationships. How closely related are they based on different structures that they may have, or amino acid sequences that they may have, or similar bone structures that they may have. And by doing this, scientists are able to give the organisms what is known as a scientific name. And we've talked about those scientific names before, genus and species. So for instance, humans would be Homo sapiens, and that would be our scientific name. And that genus species name is given to us based on different characteristics as well as these evolutionary relationships. But we can actually track this way back to about 350 BC to someone by the name of Aristotle. I'm sure you guys have heard of Aristotle before, philosopher, so on. He actually started this whole thing of classification. But if we think about his system was, hey, let's look at living things. And living things can either be plants or animals. Well, you have to remember, back in 350 BC, they weren't traveling to different areas. They weren't seeing the amount of organisms that we know that are out there. They kind of lived in their little village or around that particular area, and they saw the plants and animals that were in that particular area. So there wasn't a lot of diversity at that particular point. But Aristotle said, okay, well, we can take animals and let's put them into land animals, sea animals, and animals that live in the air. So they were kind of based on their environment. Plants, he said, well, we can have really short plants like your grasses. We can have shrubs, which are a little bit higher up, or we can have trees. So plants he kind of separated or classified based on size. The problem is organisms, the more and more that they discovered different organisms, they saw that they were able to fit in different categories. So for instance, you're walking along, you see a duck, and you go, oh, I'm going to classify him as an animal. Great, but are you going to put him in as a land animal because they walk on land? They swim in the water, and they fly in the air. So the more and more organisms that they discovered, they realized that they weren't able to kind of classify them based on this system. So about the mid-1600s, a scientist by the name of John Ray comes along. And he says, well, we got to kind of build upon this system a little bit. So what he does, he's actually the first to use the word species. And when we talk about species, we're talking about organisms that are able to interbreed with one another and produce fertile offspring. Because we know that there are organisms of different species that can produce offspring. So a horse and a donkey, for instance, create a mule. But that mule that they create is not fertile. They cannot go on and make little baby mules. So even though they are different species and they produce offspring, those offspring are not able to make more offspring. So there's kind of always these little exceptions to the rules. So besides using the first to use the word species, John Ray is also the first to actually use Latin names. And we'll talk about that a little bit more on the back here in a moment and why these Latin names are so important. So we go along and we get to what is known as our father of taxonomy. And so about 1700s, there is this scientist by the name of Carl Linnaeus. And Linnaeus is considered this father of taxonomy. He comes up with more of these rules and ways to classify things. And he basically grouped organisms on similar body structures, cell structures, developmental similarities, metabolism, a lot of things that we're going to talk about when we get to evolution. So things like homologous structures, analogous structures, amino acid sequences, embryological development. So even though he didn't have those kind of terms for him, that's what he was looking at. And like I said, we will touch that when we get to evolution next week. So he based his system on two things. So he kind of did this hierarchy system, and he said, okay, let's have 7 taxonomic groups. Let's have 7 groups that we can kind of divide these organisms, these living things, based on traits that they have. So each organism would have a 7-part classification system. So since then, since Linnaeus has done it, we're actually going to talk about something called a domain. And domains you'll see on the chart next. So we've actually created, and this has changed all within, 15, 20 years, and so on. And I said this before, when I was in school, yep, it was kingdom, phylum, class, order. You guys are now seeing domains. When I was in school, there were only 5 kingdoms. Now there are 6 kingdoms. So scientists are constantly changing this as more and more organisms are discovered, as our DNA information gets a little bit clearer to us, and we can actually see how amino acid sequences evolve. They actually start splitting organisms into more kingdoms and domains. But Linnaeus' system, kingdom, there are 6 kingdoms. We talked about plants, animals, protists, fungus, eubacteria, and archaeobacteria. And then we have those 2 bacteria kingdoms. So let's take one of our kingdoms and let's talk about the animal kingdom. So animal kingdom is very diverse. It goes everything from, let's say, sea sponges all the way up to humans. So kingdom doesn't really give you a lot of information about a particular organism. It is very broad, meaning there are a ton of organisms in there that really don't relate to one another. So if we take that animal kingdom and we start to split it up, and so from kingdom we go to phylum, we get a little bit more information, we get a little bit more specific. So phylum, within the animal kingdom, let's go to the chordate. Within the animal kingdom, let's go to the chordate phylum. We'll talk about animals with backbones. So what does that mean? Well, we're getting rid of organisms like sea sponges, and we're getting rid of insects and mollusks and echinoderms and things like that. And now let's keep things like reptiles, amphibians, fish, humans, dogs, cats. So we're breaking it down and we're getting a little bit more specific. We're getting more information about that organism that we're looking at. We can keep going. We can break the phylum down into class. We can break class down into order. And each time we do it, we're pulling out more characteristics that we're looking for, and we're getting more and more specific about a particular organism. So this is actually the one going through humans. So if we go backwards, humans are in the animal kingdom. They're in the chordate phylum, meaning they have backbones. In class, they're within mammals, produce live young, produce milk for their young. They are in primates, so hairs, shape of the teeth. We're in the Hominidae family. And then our genus and species is Homo sapiens. There is no other organism on this planet that has that genus and species name besides humans. So species is going to be your smallest taxa group or taxonomic group. It gives you the most information. So we talked about it before. Species are a group of organisms that are able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So you should know this in order. King Philip came over for grape soda. King Philip came over for good spaghetti. Doesn't matter. They come up with a little saying so that you remember these in order. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. You will see some classification questions on our evolution test when we get to the end of that section. That will kind of be your last test for, I guess, the year, we can say at that point. So we talked about these rules before, but binomial nomenclature. So we get down to genus and species. Now we got to go through and we got to kind of name our particular organisms. So we use this binomial nomenclature, bi meaning 2. It's a 2-part naming system. And those 2 parts that we're going to be using are genus and species, which means that no other organisms are going to have those names based on the characteristics that they have. So we said that the first word within that binomial nomenclature is going to be the genus name. The second word is going to be species. There are a couple of rules for it. So here we go. Our rules. It's always written in Latin. And the reason is, no matter where you go, that Latin name is going to be the same. and like a common name. So if I see a large cat someplace, I might say, oh, look, there's a cougar. Someone else might go, oh, there's a puma. Oh, there's a lion. It's a large cat. But if we use that Latin name based on characteristics that we're looking at, we should all call it by the same name. So we're always written in Latin. It's either underlined or put in italics. You don't need to do both. It's either or. Your genus name, that first part will always be capitalized. Your species will always be lowercase. So for instance, if we were looking at Homo sapiens, human, genus is Homo, species is sapien. Homo is capitalized, species is lowercase, so sapiens is lowercase, and I underline them both. They are written in Latin. So those are the rules that you have. If we take those particular kingdoms, and you guys look at this little chart, which is the next little thing that I attached in terms of notes. I said, since we had our kingdoms, scientists are learning a little bit more and more. When they go, oh, well, let's group them into domains. So to go a little bit more broad than kingdoms, we go to domains, and there are 3 domains. The first 2 actually deal with bacteria. So we have our bacteria, which is our common bacteria, eubacteria, and we have our archaeobacteria, our ancient bacteria, and different genes within them that theory-wise, or if we look at the DNA and the genes within them, eukaryotes are more closely related to archaeobacteria, the genes that are located within them. Well, this is theory-wise first form of life on Earth, and saying that kind of everything evolved from this archaeobacteria. It was able to live in harsh conditions, which is what was on the planet as it was forming. Our third domain is eukarya, and what that means is that every other organism that's made up of eukaryotic cells. They have a nucleus, they have membrane-bound organelles, they're a little bit larger, they can be single-celled, they can be multicellular. Your archaeobacteria and eubacteria, remember, they are prokaryotic. They are smaller, they have no nucleus, they have no organelles. All of them have DNA. All living things have to have DNA. So you can see some of the characteristics of not only our domains, but then also our kingdoms. So eubacteria, archaeobacteria, protists, those are like the amoebas and parameciums that we looked at underneath the microscope. Fungus would kind of be like your mushrooms and yeast, plants, as well as animals. And that's kind of what we're going to be looking at. We're going to look a little bit at this evolution of animals, and you guys can see some of the characteristics of them. I talked about kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Here's a little breakdown. This is the last little thing that you guys have in your notes. So across the top are those taxonomic groups. Here it kind of shows you how it broke down. And I broke this down in terms of humans, and I said humans were within the animal kingdom. Well, so are all of these guys. So I'm not giving you a lot of information. If I say, oh, pick me out an organism within the animal kingdom, and I'm trying to get you to pick out humans, you'd be like, oh, I like this little guy right here, this little worm. Well, we're not looking at the same organism. So I say, okay, let's get a little more specific. Pick me out an organism within the animal kingdom that has a backbone. Oh, so now we're going to look at chordates. Well, that gets rid of all of these guys. They do not have backbones. My reptiles, my amphibians, my fish, my birds, my primates, my gorillas, dogs, cats, all those guys do. Okay, so now you're like, oh, maybe I'm going to pick out the seagull. Well, I'm still trying to get you to get the human. So let's go a little bit more in terms of information. I say, okay, well, within that animal kingdom and the chordate phylum, let's look at mammals in terms of class. And I say, okay, they give birth to live young, and they produce milk for their young, and they have mammary glands, and they usually will have hair. Well, that kind of gets rid of these guys. So now we're getting a little bit more specific, a little bit more information about it. And then I go, okay, let's look at our order. And it talks about the shape of the teeth and maybe what they eat. So your carnivores would eat more of your meat, and then we've got primates, which have more of like the flat teeth rather than the sharp teeth. And we can keep going until we get to that genus and species. And this will show you how closely related things are. So I can say, oh, humans and gorillas, they're pretty closely related. They're in the same kingdom and phylum and class and order and family, and they split at genus. So the more groupings they are in together, the more closely related they are. So in terms, we could say humans are more closely related to gorillas than they are to the gray wolf, because they may be in the same kingdom, phylum, class, but then they split from there. Or I might look at humans and the monkey down here. They're in the same kingdom, phylum, class, order, but then they split when they get to that family. So the more groupings they are in together, the more closely related those organisms are. So with this assignment, you guys are going to see a little worksheet that's going to kind of go through a little, looks like a little spider web. It's going to start out with the animal kingdom. It shows all these different phylums and things like that. And you guys are going to answer some questions about how closely related things are. Then tomorrow, you guys will get some information on what is known as dichotomous keys, and it's a way that scientists go through and classify things. And you guys will have a little shark classification key that you'll have with that. And that will kind of finish us up for the week, and then we'll look forward to going through and completing some stuff with evolution next week. So last little bit, and this was on the back sheet too, before I forget, it shows your domains and it talks about the differences between the domains of your archaeobacteria, your regular bacteria, and eukarya. And we'll talk about this more. This is kind of what is known as a phylogenetic tree. And it talks about how things evolved, which is why we put it with evolution. So we're saying, okay, about 3 billion years ago, we have that single original cell, theory-wise. We'll talk about how it got there. And remember, this is all just theory with evolution. I'm going to bring it to it from a scientific point of view. If you have other theories, great. If you want to talk about them, even better. I'm not saying this is how things came about. I'm just saying from a scientific point of view, this is some theories that we may have. So we're going to talk about how this original cell kind of evolved to a bacteria, where photosynthesis comes in, where we go from unicellular to multicellular, and how we kind of get all these particular kingdoms and how they kind of branched off from each other and kind of evolved from each other. So that's what's known as a phylogenetic tree. You'll see that a little bit more next week, like I said. Okay, so hopefully that helps you guys out a little bit. You guys will also have a little Ed puzzle tomorrow with some dichotomous keys. You're going to want to watch that first before you go through and actually do the shark dichotomous key. That will help explain it just a little bit more with that. All right. Thanks. Have a great day. Let me know if you guys have questions.